So we are just trying to introduce the course, which is an online course on agricultural policy in Africa. So we'll be covering issues and challenges in policy process in Africa. So we'll just give you the introductory parts in terms of what the course will be covering. So we'll be covering the introduction to the agricultural policy process. Then we'll actually go to the broad issues in terms of the agricultural policy. Then we'll cover agro-industry developments in agriculture. Then also we'll cover topics on agricultural industry, or what we call the green industry. Then also we'll look at the funding of agricultural policy in Africa. Then we can actually end by looking at the process of policy and strategic formulation. Then we can also now look at the introduction in terms of the policy process. Okay, so we can talk about the importance of agriculture in developing nations, of which are the most important issues in terms of why agriculture in developing nations. So we know that in terms of agriculture, we know that most African countries, we can see that, most people, or what we call the majority of people, live in rural areas, of which is the mainstay in terms of what the people do there, what is it that they do in terms of their livelihoods, so which means they depend on agriculture mostly. Then also we can see that the agriculture is the major employer in terms of the livelihoods of people who live in rural areas, so which means it provides employment. Then also we can look at the source of food and income in the rural areas, so which means agriculture provides food and income for the rural poor. Then also we can look at the other importance of agriculture in African countries. We can see that agriculture is the major earner of foreign currency, because what we produce, we actually export, which means we'll actually be getting the much needed foreign currency. Then also we know that agriculture is actually seen as the driver of economic development, because it contributes much on the gross domestic product, or what we call GDP, in most developing countries. So because most of the African countries, if you look at the studies that have been done, you can see that agriculture contributes to about maybe 30 to 40% to GDP in most African countries. Whereby we can now look at the current food security challenges in Africa. And these challenges are actually consistent in two dimensions. The first challenge we can look at is more on the involvement. So which means it involves meeting the needs of food needs from domestic production in terms of domestic agricultural resources, so which means we need to produce food to meet the needs for our domestic consumption. Then also it involves the importation of food items that cannot be produced efficiently, which means if you can't produce our own food, which means we have to import so that we can actually meet the deficit in terms of what we need as a nation. Then also we can see that the other issue is on the exportation of commodities, which we have a comparative advantage. So which means if we produce surpluses, then we can export those commodities, which we have a comparative advantage in. So also that brings in more the much needed foreign currency. And also the other issue is more on the eradication of poverty among the majority of households. Because we know that we need to eradicate poverty. So that also means that there is inadequate and unstable food supplies. Also lack of purchasing power within the households, weak institutional support networks, poor nutrition, inadequate safety nets, and also food emergency management systems and unemployment. So these are more of the two consistent dimensions in terms of food security challenges in most African countries. So now we can go to, so now we can talk about the definition of food security, because the definition of food security can be defined in so many ways. So the World Summit definition for food security exists when all food, or when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active, healthy life. So that's the first definition given by the World Food Summit. Then also, we can look at the second definition of food security, which is given by the SS Integrated Food Security Strategy definition, which looks at the physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food for all South Africans by all times to meet their dietary and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Then we can see that these two definitions in terms of food security are actually determined by, let's say, if there's a failure to achieve food security, then that equals to food insecurity, given by the two definitions. Because also we can also talk about food security, not at national level, but we can shift from national food security to household food security. And this has been actually laid out since the 1970s. Because also we can see that given these two definitions, we can see that, the food security equation can actually be given as food security as a function of food availability, accessibility, and also the nutrition part, which is given in the two definitions. Okay, so now we can go to food entitlements. And here we are talking about ways to access food. So now we can look at the trade-based entitlement, which means we have to look at trade as an entitlement for access to food, which means we can import what is not available in our countries. Then also we can talk about the production-based entitlement, whereby we have to produce our own domestic requirements. Then also we can talk about own labor entitlement, of which you can also use our labor to actually have access to food. Then also we can also look at the inheritance and transfer entitlements. So which means we actually have inheritances which can support food security and also food transfers or transfer entitlements in terms of food, which will also provide access to food. So these are the four main ways in which we can actually access food, which means trade, production, own labor, and also inheritance and transfer entitlements. Okay, so we can go to the next slide, which is actually more on the elements of food security. As I said before, what are the elements, or what does the food security equation encompass? So we can talk of availability, which is physical presence of food at different levels nationally. Then we can talk about access, which is the ability to obtain food at all times, which means if the food is available, can we easily access it? So do we have the purchasing power to access that food? Because it can be available, but you might not be having the accessibility part. Then also we can look at the element of utilization, which is the ability to convert food into energy, which is more encompassed on the nutritional part. Then also we can look at the sustainability or stability, which is the ability to sustain availability of food. So we can look at the elements of food security in four ways: availability, accessibility, utilization in terms of nutrition, and also stability is the sustainability of that food. So which you can actually say this is your food security equation. Okay, then we can also talk about food security in terms of, remember we said there's food security, which equals also food insecurity when we don't have enough food. So what is food insecurity? We'll talk about food insecurity not necessarily the result of the inability to produce enough food, but inability to purchase that food as well. So when you talk about food insecurity, we are talking about, do we have necessary food, or we don't have insufficient food? Then also we are saying, do we have that purchasing power or enough food to actually provide us what we need as food security? So we can see that we also have the roots of food insecurity. So what are the roots of food insecurity in terms of that food not being available and not being able to purchase that food? First of all, we can look at the root of food insecurity, which ran from improper macroeconomic policies to economic and political structures inhibiting access to food. So, in other words, we can say food insecurity can come from improper macroeconomic policies, political structures that will actually inhibit access to food. Then we can talk of food insecurity as being transitory. So we can say transitory food insecurity can be temporal decline in access to food. So when you talk of temporal decline in access to food, we can actually define it as transitory food insecurity. Then we can talk of chronic food insecurity. So what is chronic food insecurity? It's what we call continuously inadequate diet access. So which means if we have continuously inadequate access to food, which will actually fulfill our dietary needs, then we talk of chronic food insecurity. Then also we can talk of what we call transitory food insecurity, which results from instability in food production and prices and incomes. So which means we can say if there is decline in production or maybe movements in prices or maybe reduction of incomes, that can be translated to transitory. Then we can talk of chronic food insecurity, which we've already alluded to as a result of lack of means to produce and acquire food, and also arbitrage, or also that will contribute to what you call poverty. Okay, yes. Okay, so causes of hunger and poverty. We can talk of the causes of hunger and the causes of hunger are related to what we call poverty as well. Yeah. So if there's hunger, that's related to causes of poverty. So what does poverty lead to? Poverty leads to people being unable to afford food and enhance people to go hungry as well. Then also, the other causes of hunger and poverty, as we know that, most of the major input into agricultural production is fuel. So if we have a rise in fuel costs, that will drive up production costs, which will in turn increases in what we call food prices, and also the production will decline in terms of the increase in food costs, and that will relate to also having effects on the consumers. So which means in turn, there's increases in food prices, which means the food products for consumers will also be less, which increases the prices for agricultural commodities and food. And that translates to hunger and poverty. And also, as commodity prices increase, it will be the poor who will be the most affected, because most, as their purchasing power is eroded due to low salaries and also the high level of unemployment. Also, this will drive the urban poor into hunger and poverty. So, which means increases in food prices is another major cause of hunger and poverty. Then also lack of adequate education, which translates to poverty and hunger, which means we need to have people to be educated enough so that they can have good education, so that they can have good jobs, so that they can also have enough education to apply maybe to the production of food, so that they can have their incomes increased, so that they can actually combat what we call poverty and hunger. So lack of education is another cause of poverty and hunger. So we continue in terms of what we call the causes of hunger and poverty. So as we know that most of the countries in Africa now are faced with this thing that we call drought. So as drought persists, this will lead to reduction of food harvest due to low yields. This is a major problem that we're actually faced with now in terms of what we call climate change, because we're actually experiencing lots of droughts and they are persisting, and that leads us into reduced food production, which means our yields are also going to go down, and that will lead to what we call hunger and poverty. So as production decreases because of maybe droughts and some other factors, increases in fuels, and the population also on the increase, most of the poor families will suffer from inadequate food supplies. Therefore, that will lead to what we call transitory food insecurity. Or maybe we can also go into what we call chronic food insecurity. Then the other issue is inadequate safety nets. So which means governments have to provide policies which actually provide safety nets for the poor so that they don't go hungry. Then also weak support networks and disaster management systems. This is also another cause of hunger and poor, because we need to manage disaster management in terms of maybe floods or maybe droughts, so that we can actually combat hunger and poverty. Also, we can look at the inadequate and unstable household food security. Because remember, we said we have national food security and what we call household food security. So at household level, are we producing enough food? So if we're not producing enough food at household level, that relates to inadequate food supplies, and that will lead to hunger and poverty. Then also lack of purchasing power. Are we having enough incomes to purchase that food? That also can lead to hunger and poverty if we have depressed incomes. Then the other issue is more on AIDS, HIV and AIDS. This is also central to contributing to hunger and poverty. In a way, we know that if people are not healthy, then they are not able to work on the fields, then which means they cannot produce their food because they are not healthy. And that will lead to what we call hunger and poverty as well. So these are some of the causes of hunger and poverty. So now here we can start talking about addressing food insecurity in, say, Southern Africa or Africa, because we are talking about all African countries. So we start at national level. So we can say that at the national level, food distribution systems, transport and communications, early warning systems, and stocks and trade policies are required to actually give us the required amounts of food at national level. And also we can look at the rapid economic growth, which must definitely be pro-poor. So we can say that we need rapid economic growth that must not differentiate or benefit the poor. So which means, in other ways, we should have inclusive economic growth, which will also benefit the poor. Then also, we can look at the generation of income. So we can say we generate income earning opportunities so that people must earn enough incomes to acquire food. Then we also talk about rapid growth of food production. So here we are saying we actually need to see smallholder agriculture contributing to food security and poverty alleviation. Because we know that most African countries, sometimes we have dual agricultural sectors whereby we have commercial and smallholder. But we can see that in most African countries, agricultural production is mostly done by smallholder farmers. So we need rapid economic food production from these smallholder agricultural producers to contribute to food security and poverty alleviation. The other strategies to mitigating food insecurity, hunger, and poverty. Besides the ones that we just covered, we can actually look at some of the other strategies which are more on enhancing the incomes and income generating capacity of the vulnerable groups, both in your urban and your rural areas as well. And also we can talk of another strategy, which is the social security and welfare services, which are actually meant to ensure effective and targeted access by eligible individuals to social security welfare services and tangible benefits. So which means governments have to actually come up with policies which will actually provide some social security welfare services to individuals or to households. Disaster mitigation, as we know that now we're actually faced with all these disasters like droughts, floods. So we need to have policies on disaster mitigation, thus protecting livelihoods during periods of stress caused by what we call the natural disasters. Then also food consumption and nutrition, promoting nutrition diets, and also have what you call a safe food supply. So we need a safe food supply, which means we need to have food which can be consumed by people, which is healthy and which is safe from maybe chemicals or all the other things that will actually cause healthy problems for households. So this is where we talk about the nutrition. Is the food that we produce nutritious enough to actually maintain healthy living households? So now we can talk about the existence of agricultural policy in Africa. What is it that we can actually say about the existence of these policies in Africa? So we can see that agricultural policy entails what you call action or what you call decision by government to achieve a particular goal. So in essence, when we talk about policy, we are just saying it entails action, or we can just say it's a course of action, which means governments have to intervene to achieve a certain goal or a certain objective. In other words, this way we can actually say this is how we define policy or agricultural policy, because we need to have some action taken, and that action has to be taken by government, which intervenes to achieve a particular goal. And also we can have some of the definitions which have been given in terms of what policy is. Seeing 1999 defines policy as a course of action or intended course of action conceived of or as deliberately adopted after a review of possible alternatives and pursued or oriented to be pursued. So as you can see, this is also being defined as a course of action by government intervention as well. Else, 1992 described policy as the course of action as well, chosen by governments towards an expect towards an aspect of the economy, including the goals of the government, which seeks to achieve, and the choice of methods to pursue these goals as well. So you can see that agricultural policy is actually a course of action which has to be taken by governments to pursue a certain goal. That might be directed to maybe certain aspects of the economy as well. And also we can see that, the agricultural policy process entails formulation, promulgation, and also application of courses of action by government and at the agricultural sector. That's in the process. It involves the design, the implementation of agricultural policies. So you can see that this course of action is formulated to actually come up with some strategies which are aimed at the agricultural sector and which are designed for that sector, and also which must be implemented. So as we know that most agricultural policies are there, but then the problem comes into implementation. Are we implementing these policies? Then what sets agriculture apart from other sectors of the economy? I think this we all know, that agriculture is different from other sectors of the economy, like your manufacturing sector, tourism, mining sector, because of these following reasons. We know that the size of the sector in most developing countries is actually large, and also large employer in terms of employment, then also is the largest single earner of foreign currency, and also it plays a major role in terms of demand of the country's natural resources, especially water and soils. So which means agriculture is different from other sectors because of these reasons that we are actually applying here. Mostly, if we look at the amount of water that is being used for agriculture, land, also another requirement, another input into agriculture, and a lot of foreign currency. We are employing a lot of people into agriculture, and the size of the sector is also very large, and also that makes this sector so unique from other sectors. And also the biological nature of agriculture. So why agricultural policies? Why are governments intervening in terms of setting policies in this sector? So generally, governments would want to intervene in agriculture or the food system because they would want to regulate first, then also create incentives, then also provide knowledge to society. So these are some of the major reasons why governments intervene in this sector. But we can say, okay, so this can be the major objective, then we can actually say these are more of the specific objectives why governments intervene. So the following are some of the general reasons why governments would want to intervene. Firstly, we have what you call the public good argument, which means anything that's being provided by government is a public good, of which you can define the public good as something where somebody is not excluded from actually consuming. Maybe if you look at maybe the bus system or transportation system provided by government, which means it doesn't exclude anyone, or maybe if you look at parks where people go, no one is excluded. So governments can intervene and say, okay, are we having a public good or not? So if it's a public good, which means government can actually intervene and say, no, we need to put in policies which will actually take care of maybe of the poor so that they can have also access to that good. Market power, failure. Markets fail, then government try to intervene. That's why you find that, most of when we have market failure, then we have maybe price distortions and everything else. That's when governments try to come in and say, okay, now we'll actually have what we call price controls, and that has got an effect on both consumers and producers as well. That's an intervention. That's one major reason why governments intervene. Market failure, or what you call market power. If you have got other industries which have got so much power, governments will try to regulate. Externalities, private and social costs, which also include market failure. When we talk of externalities, we can actually give example of, say, in agriculture, whereby people will actually try to practice what you call shift and burn agriculture. So that destroys the forests, but during that destruction of those forests, the externality is that future generations will not actually benefit because forests will have been destroyed, which means it's a negative externality to future generations. That's just one example of externalities. Information. If we don't have perfect information, so which means governments will try to intervene. For an example, let's say in agriculture, whereby we have farmers who don't have information on what the prices are on their commodities, let's say in the urban areas where they have to transport their commodities, which means they don't have knowledge on what the prices are. So governments will try to intervene in terms of providing maybe radios or maybe cell phones to farmers, information on what the prices are of certain commodities on certain markets where they have to sell their commodities. So these are some of the reasons why actually governments intervene. So some of the specific reasons for agricultural policy. One of them is fluctuations in agricultural production prices and incomes. So if we have fluctuations in production, fluctuations in prices, and fluctuations in incomes, that's why you actually see governments trying to come up with policies which address this. Rural poverty and income inequality is also another reason why government also come up with policies. Small, scattered, and unorganized farmers. This is another reason also why policies are actually given so that they can address this situation whereby they need to coordinate these scattered farmers and organize them into maybe farmers who will actually have power to actually produce their commodities and market them efficiently. Poor access to agricultural support services. So if we have poor access to agricultural support services, that entails that, we need government to intervene so that they can set these policies which will have support for farmers. We can talk of extension services and all those things whereby the government will actually intervene and provide more extension workers so that farmers can produce efficiently. So when you go to policy priorities, we're actually saying concurrent hunger, nutrition deficits, and this thing that we call obesity are at the center of problems associated with agricultural policy. So some of the priorities are as follows. Search for policies solving all three problems, increasing focus on demand policies, which means we need to focus on these three: nutrition deficits, obesity, and also some of the problems which are related to hunger. Shifting from self-sufficiency to sovereignty. Because most of the time we say, okay, if we need food security, we need to have national availability of food. So at the national level, we have actually food self-sufficiency. Are we producing enough food to feed ourselves? But then we are also talking about national sovereignty of a country. So here the argument is that we need to shift from self-sufficiency to sovereignty in terms of food production. Are we sovereign in terms of food production? Shift from national to household food security. Because remember, we're saying food security is more on availability of food at the national level. But now we're saying, do we have food security at the household level? Do we have enough food at the household level? Of which most of the people are now saying, let's shift from national to household food security. Food safety policies, safety nets, and health linkages. Remember, we talked about food nutrition. So here I'm saying, are we producing safe food? Do we have policies which look at the production of the safety of food? And that food must have nutrition. Also, we need to have safety nets in terms of food production and distribution of food to those which are vulnerable. Now we are talking about food security on the supply side. So we are saying the new supply side concerns that would be regarded as policy priorities are as follows. So we are now looking at the production side, supply of food. So we need productivity, which is increasing to reduce poverty. We need to choose technologies which are actually appropriate for production processes or practices. We also need commercialization and structural adjustments or maybe structural changes in agriculture. So in other words, we are saying, do we really need to go commercial or small scale? Or we need to have some structural changes in the agricultural sector in terms of production. Use of water efficiency. Are we using our water efficiently? Do we still need those old systems of maybe irrigating, using flood irrigation, or we go into some of these new technologies which are more center pivots, which are actually more water efficient? Sustainable management of natural resources. Are we managing our resources sustainably so that we can have these natural resources available for future generations? Institutions. Do we have good institutions which actually apply what we call collective action? So institutions are very important also in terms of providing the necessary support to agriculture. So now, still continuing on the policy process, now we can look at the linkages, linking agriculture to what we call macroeconomic policies. So as we know that, policies can be made at this sector, which is agriculture, but are they linked to policies made at the macro level? Because most of the time we find that government has policies which are made in the agricultural sector without looking at policies that are made at the macroeconomic level. So in other words, we are saying that we need to synchronize these policies. Policies that affect agriculture can also be coming from macroeconomic policies. And these macroeconomic policies can also go and affect policies that are being made in agriculture. So if you can look at agricultural performance is influenced by mostly macroeconomic policies, of which you can talk about your fiscal policies, your monetary policies. All those things can actually affect the performance of agriculture. So if, let's say, your monetary policy exchange rates go, maybe the devaluation or maybe the value of the currency goes up, which means that will also affect exports in this sector. Even your inflation, even your government spending, in terms of the fiscal policies, will also affect policies in this sector. So in particular, if you look at the trade-related macroeconomic policies, of which I was just saying, so if your exchange rate goes down, then also it affects your export. Macroeconomic policies interact with agriculture largely through your effects on inflation, real exchange rates, incentives, exports, also imports, of which I just mentioned. So in turn, what you're saying, your macroeconomic developments are influenced by developments in the agricultural sector as well, particularly the latter, which is the external performance as well. But also there are other external linkages of which you can actually solve, because your external linkages can come from other countries' outside maybe Africa or maybe in other countries as well, which can also affect policies here, macroeconomic policies, and agricultural policies in our African countries as well. So the agricultural policy process is also influenced. Agricultural policy is influenced not only by what is happening within the agricultural sector, but also by developments in the national and international arena as well. As I said, domestically, what happens in terms of policies will also affect the agricultural sector. Externally, internationally, what happens in the international arena will also affect the agricultural policies in our domestic markets. Because let's say the US dollar is devalued, that will also have an effect on our domestic currency. That will also have an effect on exports and imports. Externally, let's say fuel prices actually increase, that will also have effects on the agricultural sector. So we can see that the sector is linked in so many ways with macroeconomic policies and also external policies. So your macroeconomic linkages are considered to be a primary source of increasing difficulty in agricultural policy management, of which most of the countries actually might not realize that when coming up with policies in the agricultural sector, they don't really look at the macroeconomic environment, of which the macroeconomic linkages are considered to be the primary source or being the increasing difficulty in setting agricultural policy or managing agricultural policies. Okay, now we can look at the existence of policies as well in terms of the nature of agricultural policy instruments. What types of policies exist? So the type of agricultural policies. One of the major instruments of agricultural policy has been government expenditure. As I said, this is more from the macroeconomic environment. How much is government spending on agriculture, which is the fiscal outlay which have been made for a variety of purposes in the sector. So we can see that a few of the more prominent forms of expenditure have been investments in infrastructure for the purpose such as your irrigation, crop storages, transportation, marketing of agricultural commodities, direct provision of credit to farmers or producers, subsidization of private credit, the funding of research, extension, seed production, financing, the deficit incurred by governments of purchasing grains from farmers at high prices and selling them to consumers at lower prices. So this is more on the subsidies given by government to farmers, which will cushion your consumers. And direct payments under land set aside or other support programs. So you can see that governments are actually spending a lot of money, which is related to the agricultural sector, which means that the expenditure on agriculture is actually a huge expenditure for most governments. So are we having policies which we can actually say we have policies where governments are spending money to promote agriculture efficiently? So we can also look at the major classes of policy interventions, often as consisted of what we call controls. Yeah. So which means we can have policies which are more related to controls. Primarily, we can look at controls on prices, also trade, because if you look at your tariffs, your quotas, or some of these non-tariff barriers can also have an impact. Then also access to land, yeah, land reform type of programs, policies, irrigation, policies on irrigation, policies on water, and also production levels themselves. Are we producing enough inputs so that they can actually have impact on the production? Yeah, input subsidies. The use of support prices, administration prices for both consumers and producers has also been widespread in all regions in the world, including all African countries as well. Direct management of production and marketing through state-owned enterprises, which have actually spanned a wide range from production, collection, collectives, sawmills, fisheries, corporations, to banks, and also marketing enterprises. So this can be attributed to some policies which are directed in terms of marketing. Some of the state-owned enterprises, some like your for an example, in other countries, which are the sole buyers and sellers of commodities. So this can also have direct impacts in terms of policies that will enhance production and marketing. So I think we've got just more of the introductory to the agricultural policy process in Africa in terms of defining what it is, what is food security, what is food, what is hunger, what is poverty, what are some of the policies, what are the definitions in terms of what policy is itself, which is more of a course of action, and some of the things that are related to policies that enhance production, and maybe the linkages between your macro policies and your agricultural policies as well. So I would say this will be maybe the first part of the introductory chapter. So I would say thank you for listening.